All right, welcome folks. Welcome everyone to another Workflows online meetup. So the topic today is building with Okta Workflows Connector Builder advanced topics. And we did one session in March. And so if you missed that session, I recommend you go and check it out. Don't leave right now. You can check it out, and I'll put a link. But again, I would encourage you to check this out. But I want to introduce our speaker, and Gray, welcome back.
Thank you.
Thank you for hosting with us again. So Gray Thrasher, he's a senior marketing manager at Okta, and so he'll take you through the advanced topics of the connector builder. A few things before we jump into this session. So this event is being recorded, and it will be available once we end the session right on the same page. We will also upload the video to YouTube, so you can also watch it there. I will send a message later today or tomorrow with, again, a link to the video and also other resources that we mentioned in the session. If you have any questions, you can put them in chat, or there's also a Q&A section, so you can also, if you would like, you can put your questions there. Let's see what else. I think that's it. Yeah. Yeah, if I remember something, I'll just jump in, or I'll type something in the chat. But other than that, Gray, the stage is yours.
All right, thank you. Hello, everyone. Yeah, so early last month, I believe it was last month, March, we did our first session on the Okta Workflows Connector Builder. And we covered pretty much the basics, and we started diving into creating our own custom connector. We ran out of time. I was getting kicked out of my hotel room at the time, but I wanted to pick up and do another session that built off of that and get into some more advanced topics and where we can actually see kind of a completed connector with some actions and things like that in there. So I'm not going to do the slides again, except for one, just to kind of recap the fundamentals here. So just looking back at this slide here, the different components that are involved in building out a custom connector. So the settings, again, that's kind of the branding, the name, description. If you had an icon or color on there, that's where you would set that. The authentication, that's going to be where you can select how users will set up their connection to whatever resource your connector connects to there. So again, the types are none if it doesn't require any connection, basic if it uses a basic authentication header, custom where really fits any other need there. Typically it's going to be for like API keys, and then OAuth 2, which is going to be like a client ID, client secret, and different scopes and grants and things like that. And then getting into the flows that build out the connector, typically you're going to build out a helper flow. So the HTTP helper flow we have there, that's going to be used by most of your other flows within your connector. So you don't have to rebuild the same logic to build out the authorization header and pass that over, things like that. The auth ping flow, that's required by the connector to establish the connection, make sure the connection is healthy and valid still. And then your action flows. So that's going to be the things that you expose as actions on your connector when a user adds it to an actual workflow. So that was just kind of the recap there. Looks like, sorry, I was just looking at some of the content comments there. Is somebody missing? Are you able to see what I'm showing here? So somebody said there's no video.
Yeah, if something is not working, so one thing to try is just reload the page, and it's not going to kick you out. It should just bring you back into the, okay, perfect.
Okay,
yeah, it just brings you back into the meetup, which is pretty cool.
All right, cool. Glad it's working there, one. All right, let's see if I can share my screen and get going here. All right. Everybody able to see my connector builder screen? And
yes, we can.
Okay. Cool. All right. So let's see. Last time, I believe we were setting up authentication for some connectors. If we get into, let me get into my connector builder here. So again, just taking a look really quick. So here's one with no authentication. And don't make me log back in. Okay, so yeah, no authentication set up here. Here is with Jira. I think they use basic authentication. So in this, we selected basic from our drop down there, and that just provides username and password. And then we could add other parameters. So in this one, we added the Jira tenant, so we knew which instance of Jira we were actually connecting to. And then we get into, here's a custom auth. This one, we just, if you select custom, you'll get nothing in here. So you can just add parameters. So we added one for an API key, set it as a password type. And then in this case, we are connecting to an Okta tenant. So we just put a field to represent that there. And then if we get into like OIG, when we built out for OIG, we're using OAuth 2. And so this obviously contains things like where do we actually authorize, where can we pick up our access token and refresh token, provides a redirect URI, and then here's a couple fields to provide the client ID and client secret. When we set this to customer, if we set this to developer, you could hard code those in there and the user would not be prompted for those. And then what scopes we're requesting when we're making use of this connector. The differences between these when we get into the flows typically be in the HTTP helper flow. So if we look at like basic auth here, we get into HTTP helper flow, we're pulling the username and password from our connection object, and we are building out essentially the basic authorization header that's required for basic auth. So username, password, we're base64 encoding that, passing that in a string with basic in front of it in the authorization header object there. And that gets merged with any other headers that might come into this request into our actual HTTP request here. So we have our merged headers there. If we look at custom auth, where we're using an API key, it's going to look similar, except for we're taking the API key, we're building out a string. In this case, Okta requires SSWS prior to that, and we're passing that in an authorization header object, which we merge with any other headers that might come in and pass that over to our request. We look at OAuth 2. Again, it's going to look similar, slightly different. Here, we're not building out the authorization header with the actual parameters that were provided. Our connection will make that connection and grab the access token. So all we have to do is grab the access token. We're passing that up into a string where we're prefixing that with the word bearer, and then adding that to an authorization header object, merging that with any other headers that come in, and passing that over in our request as well. So really, that's where you'll see the difference with the different authorization types. So I think last time we had the session, we put up a poll to see, okay, what are the different authentication types you might be dealing with for the apps that you're building a connector for? And I think the two most popular in the poll were like dealing with an API key. So that would be the custom auth, and then OAuth 2. And that's what we showed there. So really, that HTTP helper flow would be similar between the two, except for when you're building out that authorization header itself. So, all right. Now that we've kind of recapped where we left off before, we'll jump back into building out our connector. So here, I think we were using this demo app. We set this up as an OAuth 2 authorization type. And we built out our basic flow. So we have our HTTP helper where we're grabbing the access token, building out the authorization header there, and then passing that to a raw request. Any call that we make through this connector is going to be going to our governance API in this case. This is going to be making calls against our Okta identity governance APIs. If this was going to an external application, obviously, whatever URL you're providing here is going to be relevant to that. So this is kind of the base URL for this application. And then any calls that we make to this HTTP helper flow, we're going to pass a relative URL. So if we want to get access requests, we'd pass in /requests. If we want to get certification campaigns, it would be /campaigns. And then obviously the request method we're passing into this helper object, headers, query body, same thing. And that just gets passed over to this raw request and returns us the status code, headers, and body there. The auth ping, this again is the flow that tests our connection, make sure it's healthy, and that we have a valid connection for this connector. So in here, we just have a try block where we're calling that helper flow that we built out. This, I think we may have built this out initially for a different type of request. So let me just make sure we've got the right thing here. Yeah. Requests. Essentially, this is what we want to build out. Let me just get this here. In your auth ping flow, you want to make a call out to your API, but you want it to be pretty lightweight because this is something that's going to run in the background. You don't want it to have to wait a long time to get a response from your endpoint. You also don't want it to be bring back a lot of data. So in this case, we're going to there, and then in our query, I'm essentially just going to limit this to one object to be returned. So that way it'll be relatively quick. Save that. So in here, again, we're calling that helper flow. I'm just calling one of the endpoints for this API. And then if it's successful, just have a message that says success. We return the status code up here and that message. If there's an error, we're going to return the status code from that, whatever error code that is, and then whatever the message is here. And then after this this block runs, we will check to see if the status code was equal to 200, if it was successful. And if so, we will say, okay, that is working, that's true. Otherwise, it'll be false, and that will tell our connector that the connection is bad there. So we will just give this a quick test here. Let's do a new connection. I think last time we gave it a try and it had the wrong information there. So here, I've created a OAuth application to get to our Okta Identity Governance APIs. I believe this is what we're using here. Just check the scopes. Yeah. All right. Here, I will just get our ID and client secret. And again, this would obviously come from whatever application you're trying to connect to if it uses OAuth. Okay. We'll just run our quick test to make sure this is working here. And it did not work. What am I missing here? Try this real quick. Okay. So this may be the one that we were using before. Okay. So in this one, again, we're setting a limit, checking the request endpoint there. We got the connection successful, and that returned a true for the working object there, and then the message in the output there. So that would tell us that our connection's healthy there. once we have the HTTP helper flow built out and the auth ping flow built out, that's when you can start building out your action flows. So the first one you would typically do is a custom API action. The reason for that is this essentially just exposes that helper flow there, and it would allow your users, your workflow designers, to be able to call any API against the resource this connector is built for without having to build out all the specific action flows for each of the possible API endpoints. So this allows you to kind of get up and running a little quicker. It also sort of future-proofs your connector in that, you know, as your APIs evolve on the endpoint, you don't necessarily have to wait for specific action flows to be built in order to take advantage of those. You can just use the custom API action card for that. So in this case, what we've got is our connection object that's supplied with any action in here. I've built out some options in here. So if we look at the options, I've created a static option group here called request method. It's a drop-down type. And here we have static values, and I have it for each of the HTTP request types. So get, post, put, patch, and delete. And then we have our inputs here. So this essentially over to the right, the preview card, is what all this would look like when you're adding this action to a workflow. So you would say, okay, I want to do a get, save that. And then here are the input fields where I can provide data to this card in order to make the call to whatever API I want to on that resource. So a relative URL, any query object, any headers, body, and then I'll get back the output objects, which are the status code, the headers, and body. So you can see here's where these came from here: relative URL, query, headers, and body. These are all text fields, but the data type determines sort of what form that data has to be passed in. So the relative URL field is text. The query, header, and bodies are all objects, and then whether or not they're required here. Those outputs are on the return output card. So built those out similarly. So I called this response, and we have their status code, headers, and bodies. Status code is a number. The header and body are objects similar to the inputs there. So again, get, click save. You have the input fields there, and then here's where we defined the output from that. So if we take a look at a workflow, and this is on the foo. Let me just make sure we have that deployed. We do. So if I come over to our workflows and say new flow and say add app action, and I don't remember if we covered this last time, but when you deploy a test connector, it's not going to show up in your list of connectors unless you select this include test connectors checkbox. So I have that selected, and I can see I have the test version of our foo connector there. So in here we have that custom API action. And once we add it, I've already got a connection set up here. But we see we get our options, that request method, and that's going to give us those options that we configured for this action flow. So I'll say I'm going to do a get, save that, and then it prompts us for the inputs that we want to provide. So in here we could say requests. If we want to provide a query, headers, body in there, we can do that. I'll just go ahead and test this from in here and just see if this works. Hopefully our connection's still good. Okay, so we got a status code 200 back. That's a good sign. And then we have our body. And this returned 15 request objects. So we could see, okay, that's working well. And then, you know, obviously this isn't what you would be doing in a workflow. This just tests to make sure that card is valid, what you're passing into it, returns what you want to. And then typically you would take the output from that and, you know, maybe parse out some specific data, do some actions based off that within your flow here.
Hey, great. There's one question if you want to answer it. So yeah, I can read it. So if any way to make the query headers and body to act like the Okta custom API action call?
Let me bring that up, and it might actually be what I was just about to show, but let's see. So if we go into the Okta card here and go down to the custom API action, we have request type. So this is already similar here. We'll say get and then save. So is this what you're talking about, where you're able to select, okay, I want to provide these. I don't care about the outputs of the header and status code. I just want the body. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, so it's a question from Mads. Yes, so he said yes.
Okay, that is actually what I was just about to show. So, so if we get in, yeah. So I'll kind of switch things up. I was going to show something else, but I will show that right now.
Okay.
So
Sounds good.
if we get back into our flows here, and actually I think I created one already down for our OIG. So if we go to our flows here, we have a similar custom API action flow here where we've got the same sort of options and the same sort of inputs. These are static inputs, and that's why it shows the way it does. So you say get, and then you're just going to get what you have there. The required just means that, you know, it's going to be a red star and you have to provide some data there. These can be null if you don't have anything to pass there. To make it more like the Okta connectors custom API card, we can use what's called dynamic inputs. So in here, if we take a look at our options, same thing. We've got our static values, get, post, put. We do see an option for like a helper flow, so that way you can make some of these more dynamic, maybe have one field dependent on another in there. But to make this similar to what the Okta custom API action card does, it's on the inputs. So we have dynamic input groups here. And in here, what this does is it uses a helper flow to determine what fields to show on there. And then the request type from our options. So we're mapping inputs to options. So we're looking at the request type that was selected in the options to help determine what fields are shown for the input fields. So in this case, we have the request type here. If I select get and save, we can see we get relative URL, query, and headers to choose from there. And then outputs, we can select those as well. And let me get back in here to show you some difference here. So, but if I select post and save that, I now get an extra field, body, in here. It's because for a get, typically you're not passing a body, but for others like post and patch and things like that, you're typically passing a body in there. So that's based off of this helper flow that we have for our dynamic input groups. And to show you how that works there, come back over here. I have this input fields helper flow. And right now I'm just kind of building these out manually. So I have 3 different items, fields here: the display name, a name that it's used to reference internally, the type, and then whether or not it's required. So these are the 3 that are always going to be displayed here, and I just call them get inputs. And then I built out another field for the body, and this is a type object and it's not required. And then I just have an assign if here. So if the request type is get, then I'm just using these 3 fields. But if it's anything other than get, I'm using those 3 fields plus this body field, and I'm returning that up. And that's what's being returned to our inputs on the configuration of that action flow. So that way you can make it a little more dynamic, and it's more like like you said, like the Okta custom API action card there. And you can do the same thing with the outputs. So let me see here. These are static, but if we were to add like a dynamic group here, you could choose a flow that would build out those as well. And I have an example for that in this Jira Basic Auth demo. So here I have these return output fields, and it's similar to what we had before. I'm not doing any logic to determine, which to include there, because it's all just going to be selectable. But I have 3 fields: one for the description, one for the project, and one for the status for a Jira object. Let me see. I'm not able to share all my screens here, but if we were to look at what is included in, sorry, this is just kind of a JSON visualizer here. If we were to look at what's included in a typical response for a Jira issue, I don't know if you can see all this data here, but that's a lot of data. If all you're interested in is like what project and status a Jira issue has, Jira has a way to say, okay, when you're making a call for an issue, just return me whatever fields you're interested in. And that's where the selectable outputs come into play. So in here, I'm just saying, okay, make the description, project, and status available to me in the output fields. And so if I go to this flow here, get issue by ID, and look at the outputs, I'm using a dynamic output group here. So I'm calling this return outputs fields flow, and it's taking a little while to come up, but you can see this is kind of what's displayed here. So I can select, okay, I want description, project, status. Obviously you could build that out further. And typically with these dynamic flows, these helper flows to build out dynamic inputs and outputs, those flows would probably call whatever your remote resource is and either do some sort of schema discovery. So some APIs allow for you to call and just get the schema of what type of objects you're dealing with. And then from that, build out that selectable list rather than kind of hard coding it the way that I did. If it doesn't have schema discovery, you could make a call out to actually get an object back and then parse the schema from that to build out those lists. But just to kind of show you how this works, let me see if we're able to test it from here. Yeah, so I'm essentially just passing these in here. Actually, let me see if I have it in an actual workflow. Let me get rid of that there. An app action, and this was in my Jira. So get issue by ID. So I have an action there. You can see these are the outputs that I have there. So if I click save, and I have an issue called SI3, I'll run this. It's just going to return me the output that I was looking for there, rather than, this massive object here. So essentially, I think I grabbed the output before. Here, if you want to compare it to this massive amount of data, it would look like this instead. We're just getting description, object, project, and status. So that's quite a bit less data to wait for and have passed back to our workflow and then parse through than something like this object here, which is pretty
great. This is a really cool tool. I shared the link in the chat, but the JSON crack.
Oh yeah, JSON crack. Yeah.
I've used it before. Actually, I'm planning to write a blog post or at least a tip about it.
I use it quite a bit, both to validate the format of JSON. So if I'm typing out JSON manually, I want to make sure that it's formatted properly. I know there's a lot of editors out there that will check format for you, but also to visualize the data. So, because sometimes it's kind of hard to see, especially if you have a lot of nested objects or arrays within your JSON object.
Exactly.
It's kind of hard to see, okay, where exactly, is the data that I'm looking for. And in here, it's a little bit easier to kind of follow through and get to the actual path.
Yeah, I mean, the visualizing is excellent.
Yeah. Okay, so so that was hopefully what you were looking for there. I think it was Mads that was looking for that, to see how to build out the dynamic inputs and outputs, similar to what you see in some of the connectors that are already available out there in the workflow connector catalog. Again, let me get back here. By ID. this was on the outputs that we saw this one. So just calling a helper flow that essentially passes back a list of JSON objects that represent the fields you want users to be able to select from, rather than statically putting them on the card there. If we get back to this one, nope, that's static there. In our OIG connector, the inputs are done in a similar fashion here. So again, we selected dynamic. So I just said add group, and I selected a dynamic group, selected the inputs there. In this case, this is asking what this maps to. So we're saying that the request type, whatever's selected here, is going to get passed into that helper flow to help determine what input fields are going to be passed back there. And again, we look at the input fields helper flow, we can see we have that request type object that's being passed in there, and that's what we're using to determine, okay, what fields should we show there? And this is kind of a basic example, but again, this might be doing schema discovery against an endpoint, building out all the potential fields there, and then if you have to do any picking and choosing of what you actually display to the user based off of options, you could use this approach here. All right, so we've got our authentication type set up. We've gone through that. We've shown the basic building blocks of a custom connector, custom API actions. So it kind of opens it up to allow the user to make any calls to your different endpoints. And again, this custom API action is kind of like a proxy to your HTTP helper flow. If we looked at it up in here, did our test. We're selecting the method you want to do, providing a relative URL, so requests or whatever is valid over there, and then building out the query headers and body. But this assumes that whoever is using this action on your connector is familiar with your APIs. So in order to make it more streamlined and abstract all that knowledge that they might have to have for your APIs, that's where you would come in and build out your specific action flows for the different requests. So in this case, we're in this OIG connector that I created, and I have some actions that I've exposed, like get requests here. So what this does is it kind of hides that logic that we just saw with the custom API connector. We are hard coding that relative URL and the request type. If there was any specific headers that are required in here, we might hard code those in here as well. In this case, I have an option for limit. So this is going to be built out in the query. I can format it in this action flow. So the user that's making this call from workflows doesn't have to know the specific format for, how do I pass in a limit query to the request endpoint? All they need to know is, hey, I want to get the requests that are out there in OIG. So if we take a look at how that looks over here in workflows, I can say, okay, my test OIG card, get requests. The only thing I'm prompted for in the options is, okay, my limit. And over in my options card in here, I've hard coded some values in this drop down. You could make this a free form field where somebody could type in, 1,000 or something like that. But here, we're just limiting it to 1, 5, and 20. And that's what we see over here when we look at our options. So I'll say 5, save this. And then I don't have to provide any input other than, how many I wanted to return. And the user can now call this, assuming my connection is valid and everything. I should see, okay, in this case, I got 5 objects. These were 5 requests that came back. So that makes it a lot easier for the people that are making use of the connector within the workflows. I didn't have to know that there is an endpoint called requests in order to get the OIG requests. I didn't have to know what format that limit filter would have to be in order to narrow down the amount of data that's coming back from the request there. I want to take it a bit further. If I come back over here, I have this get request by date. And here, we have our limit in there, and then I've provided an input field for a date. And this is going to be combined with that limit into my query object. So again, I don't have to know that, okay, if I want to find requests that are since a certain date, I don't have to know that there's a last updated value, and I have to use the GT greater than syntax and then provide the date in a certain format in order to make that that call with that filter. So if I come back over here, again, let's select that OIG connector. I have this get request by date. And if this was the first time I was doing it, it would prompt me with the options, and I could say, okay, I want 5 here, save that, and then provide a date in here. So you do have to know the format of the date, but this is something that could be provided with, a date and field. Where is now? There we go. So now, and then maybe we subtract. So if we do, I believe it's date, subtract 90 days or something like that, and then we pass that in. I kind of remove these, and then we can run the whole flow. And see, I got 5 objects back because I set that limit to 5, and each of these objects should be older than 90 days. So that's just another way to make some of these calls a little easier for the end users that are going to be making use of these within the Okta workflows. Let me see if there's one more thing. I know we're running a little short on time here. Where did it go? This has the dynamic inputs. And I believe I did show you this one as well. So I mean, if I turn that on and we deploy it, I think we went. This would be essentially the last part. The deployment of the connector itself. So once you've built out your connector and some flows, so here we have our OIG. We've got a couple action flows. So any of these that start with action over here, again, it was with an action card at the beginning. Those will be exposed as actions on your connector as long as they're turned on. And then, so once you've got those set up, you've tested them, everything looks good, you'd come over to deployment, click create test version. That's how those show up over here. You say, okay, add a new connector, include test version. These are going to be grayed out and be prefixed with test there. Then you can test them within your workflows to make sure they work in that context there. And after that point, you could say, okay, private deployment. I have version 1 deployed there, but if I come over here, I could say deploy version for my latest test version or one of the previous ones. And then what that'll do is it'll take a little bit longer, but it will deploy a private version of your connector, excuse me, within your org. So that way you don't have to select that test connection or test connector checkbox in there. It'll be listed with the rest of the connectors that are available in our catalog. So if we come over here, and that was for our OIG, we see OIG listed right there. It's also listed down in the catalog here. These are the ones I have connections for right now. And it'll be just like any other one. So here we can say get request by date. It'll show up with its branding and color scheme there, whereas the test ones will be kind of grayed out. But again, this will only be available within the org that you created it in. If you wanted to publish this up to the catalog, so have it up along with like, Atlassian, DocuSign, these ones here, and available for other customers to use. So if you are a vendor of an application, then that's where you could take it to the next step and say, submit connector. So you'd click on this, you'd go through whatever it is, in order to have that submitted to Okta for review. And then once that is passed through all that, then it would be included in the catalog here. And anybody with an Okta org that has workflows would be able to make use of that connector there. So I think we are just about at time. Any questions pop up while I was talking away?
No questions, but people, if you have any questions now, feel free to type them into the chat, or also Q&A. So there's one question. Where do you see it, or you want me to read it?
From Troy, are we able to build in one Okta org and then migrate them to a prod or Okta org? Not currently. That's something I've been asking for a while. Yeah. So right now, with normal Okta workflows, you can export those and import them, but not with the connectors yet. I did talk to the connector builder team. I believe that's something they're looking forward for doing. I mean, it makes sense that, hey, you're going to build this out in a test org. You probably want to promote it to a production org, but it's not quite there yet. Connector builders just got released, I think last month, right, Max?
Correct.
So yeah, so hopefully that'll be coming soon. Will there be one point connectors not made by vendors? Yeah, Bram. Not sure if there's going to be the ability to essentially export or publish connectors to a community where somebody might be able to pick them up. Obviously, you could document what was done, and put that out to a community, and somebody would have to recreate that within their connector builders and their orgs with the current state of things. But that's a good question. I'll bring that up to the connector builder team to find out.
Yeah, I don't. I think I remember there was some discussion about perhaps making it possible. But yeah, something we can check, and I can perhaps include it in the follow-up message. So yeah, we can do that.
All right. Yeah, so it looks like somebody's built a connector around Freshdesk. Oh, just for the management there. Okay. Yeah. So again, I think in the first call we had, there were kind of three scenarios where we typically see customers wanting to build custom connectors. Either they have a homegrown app that there's never going to be a public connector for, so they're building that out for something in-house. We also see customers building connectors for third-party apps that we don't have a connector for in the catalog yet. Or we see vendors wanting to create connectors to include in our catalog for their applications. So, it looks like Mads had one there that was probably the third-party application that we don't have a connector for yet, right? Jackson was trying to build something for advanced Jamf APIs. Yeah. We have our Jamf Pro connector there. So for connectors that are available in the catalog, if you're not seeing specific actions that you're trying to call there, typically that's where that custom API action card comes into play. If that doesn't work, so here again, well, I don't have a connection for that, but just like the ones that we showed before, that's essentially the proxy to the HTTP helper card there. So you're providing the endpoint, the request method, any headers, body, query, things like that. So you could should be able to take advantage of any API endpoint that the application has available. And if that doesn't work, you could add the function to either just make a raw request to an HTTP endpoint. But this is similar to using the custom API card for any public connector that's out there. All right. Brent's been busy building out connectors.
Yeah. No, I'll check on that. I'll include something in the follow-up message.
Okay.
But yeah. So yeah, we'll do that. Well, very good, great. This was wonderful. Thank you for coming back, and
no
thank you everyone for joining us today. If there are any other topics that not necessarily connector builder, but just in general workflows you want us to cover, please let us know here, or you can always just reply to the message that we'll send out. Both of our emails will be there. But other than that, again, thank you very much. And then we'll see you next time. We'll definitely have an event or two in May.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.